In this entry, we'll be taking a look at Wilson Fisk, otherwise known as the Kingpin, from the Daredevil TV series originally on Netflix. But before we proceed, a small disclaimer. This video will only be focused on the character that we see in Daredevil Seasons 1 to 3, and not on the new incarnation that we see in the other shows of Hawkeye, Echo, and Daredevil Born Again. This is primarily for the reason that the character has undergone some changes to fit him into the more family-friendly MCU. Basically, he walks, talks, and expresses himself differently. Therefore, what will be covered from here on won't be applicable to the new iteration, but perhaps we can have an analysis of that version of the character in the future too. Now back to the content. One of the most evil characters to appear on the small screen, Wilson Fisk was a ruthless crime lord whose mere presence brings an uncanny sense of dread. Just when you think you've seen the bottom of his evil, he pulls out yet another act that shows his depravity can go even lower. Before we're officially introduced to the character, Fisk remains a man of mystery, preferring to hide in the anonymity of the shadows and acting vicariously through his right-hand man, Wesley. Fisk has an established rule where none of the people working with him can say his name. While Vladimir suggests that it's because he wants to avoid being seen as just a man as fallible as them, personally, this rule of not using his name stems more from how secretive Fisk is and how much he requires anonymity. When Fisk does appear on screen, one of the first things he says is the fact that he feels alone when he comments on the rabbit in a snowstorm painting. The painting aside, by nature of his personality and his position, Fisk comes across as a lonely man. Throughout his daily life, he has limited social interaction, being only surrounded by mostly silent bodyguards, with his only friend being his assistant Wesley. He is most likely a recluse at this point, as the Russians tracking him make a big deal whenever he makes an appearance in public. Fisk is also a creature of habit, defaulting to his usual outfit of a fully black suit and his daily breakfast of a 2-egg omelet fried in butter, a practice that he continues even during his time in prison. Now, of course, a person can be alone without feeling lonely, but Fisk is likely to be experiencing both. There is a sense of sadness that is apparent in his eyes, revealing that Fisk is a man of much inner turmoil, which has kept him socially insular. He is a man of few words, and the few words that he speaks sound painfully forced. When he first meets Vanessa, it's noticeable that he repeatedly fails to maintain eye contact with her, and more than once he fails to catch on to her sense of humor. But this is more likely due to the fact that he is nervous about speaking with a woman he's still new to, an occurrence that doesn't happen often, as he himself admits. Fisk appears to come across as a man of class, wearing expensive suits, dining at high-end restaurants, and drinking vintage wine. But just like other aspects of his character, it's all a facade. He actually doesn't know much of the cultured life, but relies heavily on Wesley, whether it's for wine recommendations or helping him with his bow tie. When he meets Matt Murdock later and is asked by Vanessa to share his advice on selecting art, he simply defers the decision and simply says to buy whatever the lady tells him to. Despite his wealth and his power, Fisk remains very much a victim of trauma, as seen by his constant waking up in a state of anxiety, in a cold sweat, and with rapid breathing. This trauma is central to Fisk's character, arising from the abuse he suffered during his childhood. As a boy, he was soft-spoken and gentle, but unfortunately the victim of bullying by his peers. The home environment was of huge stress too, as his overbearing father was an abusive alcoholic responsible for much domestic violence. Wilson's father despised him for his meek and submissive nature, and coaxed him to use force as a means to assert himself, even to the point of kicking an already downed opponent. Sadly, this lesson was learnt, but not in the way it was intended, eventuating in his father's gruesome death in an attempt to save his mother from domestic abuse. This act of patricide, combined with the prior abuse, becomes the spark that ignites his change from an innocent, mild-mannered boy into the monster of a man at present. Remarkably, despite the painful memories, Fisk still makes it an effort to keep his abusive childhood ever present before him. You would think that given what he has suffered, combined with the horror and the guilt from the act of patricide, that Fisk would want to move on and have as little semblance of his past as possible. Instead, he keeps reminders of his father and uses them as sources of motivation, as we see with his choice of art, the rabbit in a snowstorm painting resembling the wall he was forced to stare at in contemplation of the man he wanted to become. Of his own admission, it is the last thing he looks at before he goes to bed, and we see that it's the first thing he sees in the morning to compose himself from his anxiety. The other reminder of his father would come in the form of his cufflinks, the only pair that he chooses to wear despite his wide collection. When asked about it by Vanessa, in his own words, Fisk mentions that he wears it as a reminder that he is not his father, that he isn't cruel just for the sake of cruelty. But obviously this claim cannot hold true in light of his own evil. We don't see his rise to power, but given his current state of morality, it's reasonable to assume it was done with much of the same kind of acts. As someone who can speak at least 3 languages, combined with his strategic mind, Fisk is no blunt instrument. He would at least be self-aware that his evil or his cruelty would easily dwarf that of his father's. Could this be a case of denial or delusion for the sake of self-justification then? We see this in other aspects of his motivation too, which we'll get to later. His father was cruel, but it would be inaccurate to say it was cruel just for the sake of it. There's no excuse for the domestic abuse, but his harsh treatment of Wilson was to toughen him up and make him more assertive, a misguided attempt at a noble goal. More likely, Fisk keeps the cufflinks as a reminder of how he has overcome his father, at least in the physical sense. After he commits the act as a boy, his mother proceeds to remove his effects before handling the body, and after removing his cufflinks, she gives it to him. So it's likely that in Fisk's mind, the cufflinks bear a strong correlation with the elimination of his father. This notion gives Fisk some form of comfort and drive, as we see that he has a tendency to touch them in times of stress. When he is dealing with the nervousness of his first date with Vanessa, he is seen touching them as a coping mechanism. Subsequently, on his second date, he again touches them when she brings up the provoking question of the kind of business he is in. As a result of his abusive childhood, Fisk has a stunted self-image, exemplified by the scene where he still sees himself as the 12-year-old boy in his reflection. Given this self-image, it accounts for his tendency to throw childish tantrums. His overflowing rage is another key trait of his, often sudden and explosive, going from 0 to 60 in a matter of seconds. Hardly anyone is safe around him with his volatile and unstable nature, not even his own men, one of whom he almost beats to death after hearing of Wesley's death. It's worth noting that in all his acts of violence, Fisk always chooses to use his hands, perhaps for the fact that it gives him a longer time to vent his anger, but he also does it simply because he enjoys it. There is a certain expression of glee that we see when he goes on his rampage, perhaps also a letting out of his pent-up resentment. As he expresses to Dex, he is of the notion that rage cannot be kept inside, but must be expressed or it will destroy him. And if he cannot use his fist at the moment, the only option left would be a primal scream. The wisdom of this sentiment is somewhat doubtful, as the more one gives in to rage, the more it makes the person even more prone to anger as a habitual response. It's therefore no surprise that Fisk is a man who is constantly given to the vicious cycle of his rage. Earlier, we touched on how Fisk keeps reminders of his past at bay with the painting and the cufflinks, but it seems that for a while he did try to leave his past behind, as he expresses to Vanessa that as a child he has been wanting to leave New York. After the death of his father, he spent most of his time abroad in Asia. Perhaps Fisk even tried turning to religion as a means of escape. When he visits Vanessa after her poisoning, he recounts that he tried to pray in the past, but it was merely an empty shell, an imitation of faith that gave him no closure. Eventually, Fisk would find no purpose abroad and comes to terms with the fact that New York is his jungle. He returns to the city he once despised, now under the supposed mission of rebuilding the city into something better. This brings us to an important component of the evil of Wilson Fisk, namely his self-deception. Despite his so-called mission for the city of a better tomorrow, he is simply looking to garner power for the sake of power. He aligns himself with the criminal organizations and the scum of the city, all of whom are involved in some form of illegal trafficking amongst a myriad of other crimes. So there is a clear discrepancy between his professed mission and his actions. Deep down, he knows his actions are devious by the fact that he hides them from Vanessa. Although his acts are heinous, we learn that Fisk sees himself in a positive light by his profession, that he has always seen himself as the Good Samaritan in the biblical parable. As it turns out, his mission to rebuild the city is more literal with regards to its architecture, with his plans to demolish and reconstruct several districts in Hell's Kitchen, which would most probably include his childhood neighborhood. It bears noting that nothing is said about the corruption and the crime that's slowly eating away at the city. In his conversation with Vanessa on their second date, he tells her that money and influence are not enough to usher change on a scale, and that sometimes it requires force. And later, he mentions that the city needs to die before it can be reborn. But this is all just an excuse for him to delude himself in his criminal dealings. Even if he were to rebuild the city's buildings, there would be no effect on the deeper issues of crime and corruption, both of which he is perpetuating. He promised to Vanessa that he would be honest with her, and we can believe that he is indeed telling what he believes to be true. But how much of that can be the actual truth when he is lying to even himself? Ultimately, Fisk wants to conquer New York for himself, perhaps as a form of payback on the city which created men like his father. It could also be a response to the challenge his father gave him as a boy, implying that he could take the city if he puts his mind to it. But what could cause such a strong delusion for Fisk? It's suggestible that this in part was caused by another trait of his, namely his lack of empathy. Now, of course, we can exclude his concern and affection for Vanessa and Wesley, as they are two people who have a direct relationship with him, so naturally it would be in his self-interest to show care for them. What we are concerned with here is the natural response that a normal person should feel when learning of a tragedy of someone you are not acquainted with, say the reported death of an elderly tenant by gang activity in the area. Despite all the lives he has taken and the many more lives he has destroyed, Fisk feels no empathy for them, and thus no shred of remorse. He doesn't take any sadistic pleasure in their sufferings, but at the same time he remains unconcerned, as if they were simply a means to an end. When Murdoch brings up all the people he has hurt, Fisk shows his complete lack of empathy when he just brushes it off, retorting that life is not a fairy tale and that not everyone deserves a happy ending. He may appear to show some empathy, and quite convincingly so, as we see when Karen comments on how outrageously genuine he seems to be when he grieves over the death of Mrs. Cardenas on the news, whose death he was responsible for. Later on, he tries this with Frank Castle when he attempts to show sorrow over the tragedy of his family, but is immediately called out for his pretense. Fisk has numerous other crimes, all of which are horrendous, and it would be too long a list to go through here. But perhaps the most noteworthy occurrence of his lack of empathy is seen in his negotiation with Mrs. Fobb over the painting. After she gives a much heartfelt recount of her own personal tragedies and plants her foot down on the decision not to sell the painting, Fisk relents and appears to show some consideration of her plight. But then he immediately shows that that is not actually the case, and that he is backing off as that is what Vanessa would have wanted. So even in his most empathetic state, It is a vicarious one, borrowed from someone else. If we're dropping labels, Fisk would most likely qualify as a sociopath for this lack of empathy, combined with the other traits of uncontrolled anger and pathological lying. He may feel embarrassed but never guilty, regret but never shame. On top of his act of patricide, another major turning point occurs for Fisk with his meeting of Vanessa, arguably the woman who will have the biggest impact on his life, although it bears noting that it's questionable as to what endears Fisk to her. Even Fisk admits before their wedding that he was afraid of his own self-deception, that perhaps the reason he was attracted to her was because he sees his own reflection in her. Perhaps it's more because of Vanessa's unconditional acceptance, that she still remains with him despite knowing of the monstrous deeds he has done. The two of them deserve each other, as we later learn that Vanessa has a propensity for evil that can match his. There's no way their relationship could work out if it weren't so. But other than a romantic interest, Vanessa represents two things for Fisk: a moving on from his father as an anchor and the crumbling of his former organization. With Vanessa by his side, Fisk is able to put his past a little more out of focus, as depicted by the change in his attire from full black suits to gray, and then eventually to white. His father's cufflinks are replaced with another of Vanessa's choice, and the painting of which serves a reminder of his father's wall becomes a symbol of his love for her. When he looks at himself in the mirror, he is able to see his own current reflection instead of his 12-year-old self. However, his relationship with her sparks the decline of his former business and his way of hiding in the shadows. Fisk ultimately has himself to blame, as it was his fragile ego that caused him to decapitate Anatoly after he intruded on their dinner date. A house divided against itself cannot stand, and the murder of Anatoly sparks off a series of chain events which result in the Chinese and the Japanese losing their trust in him. But it is here that Fisk starts to acquire some self-awareness, after Madame Gao's speech to him that he cannot be both savior and oppressor, or light and shadow at the same time. This message was driven home by two events: Vanessa's near-death experience from the betrayal of his colleagues, as well as the death of Wesley, whom Fisk mistakenly assumed was done by the same parties. These two events helped to tear down his self-deception, as seen by Fisk realizing that he is not the Good Samaritan in the parable, but now views himself as the robber of evil intent. The admission of his hypocrisy is also exemplified in his brawl with Daredevil, where he declares his true intent that the city doesn't deserve a better tomorrow, that it deserves to drown in its filth. Post-incarceration, Fisk now has a different approach in his dealings with other criminal organizations. He no longer seeks to partner with them as he did with Gao and Nobu after the betrayal of the former left him scarred. Instead, Fisk simply resorts to extorting from them in exchange for sparing them federal prosecution. With his identity already made public, instead of his formal rule of maintaining anonymity, he goes by the codename of Kingpin, a title of respect which he carries over from his time in prison. It would seem that Fisk has benefited from his stint in lockup. Physically, he has become much bigger and stronger, being able to bench press what appears to be 495 pounds for multiple reps. Mentally, Fisk has sharpened his criminal insight for the real world, as he mentions that prison is simply a micro-representation of society at large. Throughout his transition, Fisk remains an opportunist, craftily twisting each situation to his own benefit. Manipulation has always been one of his tools, as seen by how he always uses a scapegoat to draw unwanted attention away from him, whether it's framing the man in the black mass for the destruction in the city, or using Frank Castle to eliminate his prison rival. But perhaps the pinnacle of his manipulation comes in his dealings with Dex, where he exploits his need for a father figure and promises him the acceptance that has eluded him all his life. And while Fisk has personally embraced his evil side, he still wants the acceptance of the public. He knows he doesn't need the public's admiration, he just has to avoid being public enemy number one, a title which he frames Daredevil with. Towards the end, things reach full circle, and his love for Vanessa once again proves to be the death of his empire. Or more accurately, his insistence in ruling New York became his downfall. There was a window of opportunity for Fisk to escape, during the time period when he had the feds under his thumb and was essentially a free man. Fisk could put all this behind him and simply live abroad with Vanessa instead of bringing her back to New York. If he had fled the country, he would have remained a free man. But as Murdoch mentions, New York is his jungle, and without his city, Fisk would be without purpose. Perhaps it's fitting that his evil side would be kept in check by the one virtue he has, his sacrificial love for Vanessa, which becomes his true prison. At the end, Wilson Fisk was a self-deceived sociopath, a selfish crime lord who ironically bore a savior complex while being a source of much misery and suffering in the city he professes to love. So what do you think of Wilson Fisk from Daredevil, folks? Check out the entry on Poindexter if you haven't. Thanks for watching, and take care.